She was 18 years old and she had nothing. No home. No family that wanted her. No job. No future that she could see. Her name was Claire Anderson, and she was the kind of invisible person that society doesn't know how to help. She was too old for foster care. She was too young to be taken seriously by adult social services. She was a teenager living on the streets in Portland, Oregon, sleeping in shelters and abandoned buildings, using whatever she could find to make the pain go away. Before we start this story, I need you to leave a comment telling me if you've ever trusted the wrong person. Tell me if you've ever had someone betray you in a way that fundamentally changed how you see the world. And at the very end, I need you to rate this story from 0 to 10. Because this is not just a story about a young woman being exploited. This is a story about what happens when vulnerability meets predation. This is a story about how the people we're supposed to trust the most can hurt us the deepest. This is a story about survival and resilience and learning to protect yourself. This is the story of Claire Anderson, and the man who seemed like salvation but who became her nightmare. Let's find out what she learned. Let's find out how she survived. Let's find out what changed everything. Claire had been abandoned by her mother when she was 16. Her mother had been struggling with her own addiction and her own demons, and she'd decided one morning that she couldn't handle being a parent anymore. She'd packed a bag and she'd left. She'd left a note that said, "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving you money for rent. Take care of yourself." The money was $300. The rent was $1,500 per month. The math didn't work. Claire had stayed in the apartment for 3 weeks before the landlord evicted her. She'd tried to find work, but she was 16 and she had no job experience and no references. She'd tried to reach out to her father, but he'd never been involved in her life and he certainly didn't want to be now. So she'd ended up on the streets. She'd ended up in shelters where she was scared every single night. She'd ended up using drugs because drugs made the fear and the hunger and the shame go away. She'd ended up pregnant when she was 18 years old and she was passed out in an abandoned warehouse with a man whose name she didn't even know. She'd realized she was pregnant when she was sick for 3 weeks straight. She'd thought it was withdrawal. She'd thought it was her body finally giving up. But a nurse at the free clinic had told her the truth. "You're going to have a baby," the nurse had said gently. "You're about 2 months pregnant." Claire had felt something shift inside her. Fear, obviously. Terror. But also something else. Something like hope. Because maybe a baby would give her a reason to stop living like this. Maybe a baby would give her a reason to be better. That's when she met Marcus. Marcus was 34 years old and he owned a small construction company. He seemed successful. He seemed stable. He seemed like exactly the kind of person that a desperate 18-year-old girl would see as salvation. She'd met him at the shelter. He'd been volunteering, helping to serve dinner to the residents. He'd paid special attention to Claire. He'd asked her questions about her life. He'd listened to her story. He'd told her that she was too smart to be living on the streets. He'd told her that she deserved better. He'd told her that if she trusted him, he could help her. "I can give you a job," he'd said. "I can help you get an apartment. I can help you get your life together. All you have to do is trust me." Claire had been so desperate that she'd believed him. She'd believed that someone like Marcus could actually want to help someone like her without expecting anything in return. She'd been so desperate that she'd ignored the small voice inside her that was warning her that this seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do that?" she'd asked him. "You don't even know me." "Because I care," he'd said. "I care about people like you who are struggling. And I want to help." In the beginning, everything had seemed perfect. Marcus had given her a job working in the office of his construction company. The job paid $13 an hour, which wasn't much, but it was more than she'd ever had. He'd helped her get an apartment, a small one-bedroom in a not-great neighborhood, but it was hers. He'd helped her set up a prenatal care plan. He'd bought her groceries. He'd done all the things that a person might do for someone they genuinely wanted to help. But then things had started to change. It had been gradual. First, Marcus had asked her to take the bus to his office instead of to the construction sites where she could have worked a more normal job. "It's safer," he'd said. You're pregnant. I don't want you exposed to dangerous conditions. Then he'd asked her to keep her job at his office private from the other people at the construction company. They wouldn't understand, he'd said. They'd think I was playing favorites. Let's just keep it between us. Then he'd asked her if he could come to her apartment to check on her after work. I want to make sure you're eating enough, he'd said. I want to make sure you're taking your vitamins. And then he'd asked for sex. It had happened after she was 6 months pregnant. He'd come to her apartment and he'd kissed her. And when she'd pulled away, confused and uncomfortable, he'd said something that would replay in her mind for years. You owe me, he'd said. I've done so much for you. The least you can do is show me some appreciation. Claire had frozen. She'd felt something shift inside her. The moment when she'd realized that the salvation she'd thought she'd found was actually a trap. No, she'd said. I don't want to. Yes, you do, he'd said. His voice had changed. The kind voice was gone. Now he was using the voice of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. You owe me, Claire. And if you don't do this, I'm going to take back the job. I'm going to help you lose the apartment. I'm going to make sure you end up back on the streets. Do you understand me? Claire had understood. She'd understood that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd understood that she'd trusted the wrong person. She'd understood that the safety she'd felt had been an illusion. She'd understood that she was trapped. She'd had sex with Marcus that night. She'd cried while it was happening. And he'd acted like nothing was wrong. He'd acted like this was a normal transaction between two people who cared about each other. Good girl, he'd said afterward. I knew you'd understand. After that night, the exploitation had escalated. Marcus had started coming to her apartment multiple times a week. He'd started demanding sex in exchange for continued support. He'd started isolating her from any friends she was starting to make. He'd started monitoring who she talked to and what she did. You can't go to the shelter anymore, he'd said. Those people are bad influences. You need to stay focused on me and the baby. You can't talk to the other girls in your building, he'd said. They're just going to try to turn you against me. He'd made her feel like she was dependent on him. He'd made her feel like without him she would die. He'd made her feel like she had no choice. And the worst part was that she'd started to believe him. When her daughter was born, Claire had felt a moment of clarity. She'd looked at this tiny human that she'd created, and she'd realized that she had to get away from Marcus. She had to protect this baby from him. But she was 18 years old with a newborn and no resources. She was living in an apartment that Marcus had paid for. She was working a job that Marcus had given her. She had no money saved, no family support, no way out. She tried to break up with Marcus 2 days after her daughter was born. I'm done, she'd said. I don't want you here anymore. I want you to leave me alone. That's not going to happen, Marcus had said calmly. You and I have a deal. You're going to keep this deal for as long as I want you to. It's not a deal, Claire had said. It was rape. No, he'd said. It was sex. And you consented. If you didn't want to have sex with me, you shouldn't have accepted my help. But then something happened that changed everything. Claire's mother called her. Her mother, who'd abandoned her 2 years ago. Her mother, who'd sent $300 and a note. Her mother had gotten sober. She'd spent 2 years in recovery. She'd spent 2 years thinking about her daughter. And she'd finally found Claire's number. I'm so sorry, her mother had said when Claire answered the phone. I'm so sorry for leaving you. I've been sober for 2 years and I've been trying to find you. I want to be in your life. I want to know my granddaughter. Can you forgive me? Claire had cried. She'd cried because she'd spent 2 years thinking her mother was gone forever. She'd cried because now she was desperate for help and her mother was suddenly offering it. There's something I need to tell you, Claire had said. And she'd told her mother everything. She'd told her about Marcus. She'd told her about the coercion and the manipulation and the sex she'd been pressured into. She'd told her about feeling trapped. Her mother had listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, her mother had said something simple but profound. You're going to leave him, her mother had said. Today. Right now. You're going to pack a bag and you're going to leave. And if he tries to stop you, you're going to call the police. But I have nowhere to go, Claire had said. You're coming to me, her mother had said. I'm in Seattle now. I've got an apartment. I've got a job. I've got my life together. And my daughter and my granddaughter are going to come stay with me. We're going to figure this out. Claire had hung up the phone and she'd felt something shift inside her. She'd felt fear, obviously. She'd felt the terror of doing something unknown. But she'd also felt hope. She'd felt the possibility that she didn't have to stay in this situation forever. She'd packed a bag. She'd put her daughter in a car seat. And she'd called an Uber to take her to the bus station. Marcus had arrived at her apartment an hour after she'd left. He'd found her gone. He'd called her phone hundreds of times. He'd left voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. Come back, he'd said in one voicemail. I'm sorry. I was wrong. We can work this out. You're making a mistake, he'd said in another. You need me. Without me, you're nothing. You're going to end up back on the streets and you're going to regret this. I'm going to destroy you, he'd said in another. I'm going to tell everyone that you're a drug addict and a bad mother. Nobody's going to believe you. Nobody's going to help you. But Claire had blocked his number. She'd gotten on the bus to Seattle. And she'd never looked back. Her mother had been waiting at the bus station. Claire had recognized her from old photographs, but her mother looked different. Healthier, stronger, more present. When they'd embraced, Claire had cried. She'd cried because she was exhausted and traumatized and so grateful to not be alone anymore. We're going to get through this, her mother had said. I promise you. We're going to get through this together. And they had. It hadn't been easy. Claire had needed therapy to process the trauma of being manipulated and sexually coerced. She'd had to report Marcus to the police. She'd had to testify against him in court. Marcus had denied everything. He'd said that Claire had consented. He'd said that she'd been the one pursuing him. He'd said that she was trying to ruin his life because he'd ended their relationship. But the judge had believed Claire. The judge had seen through Marcus's lies. And Marcus had been convicted of sexual abuse of a minor and coercion. He'd been sentenced to 5 years in prison. But even with Marcus in prison, the trauma didn't disappear. Claire had struggled with trust for years. She'd struggled with recognizing warning signs. She'd struggled with believing that people could genuinely want to help without expecting something in return. She'd started going to therapy. She'd started processing what had happened to her. She'd started to understand that what Marcus had done wasn't her fault. She'd started to understand that she hadn't been stupid for trusting him. She'd been a desperate kid who needed help, and Marcus had exploited that desperation. With her mother's support, Claire had gone back to school. She'd gotten her GED. She'd started taking college classes. She'd discovered that she wanted to work in social services. She wanted to help young people like her who were vulnerable and desperate and at risk of being exploited. 5 years after leaving Marcus, Claire was working as a case manager at a nonprofit that served homeless youth. She was 23 years old. She had a small apartment that she'd rented with money she'd earned. She had a daughter who was in preschool. She had a future that looked nothing like the future she'd thought she'd have when she was 18 and pregnant and living on the streets. But more importantly, she was using her experience to help other people. She was training to recognize signs of exploitation. She was teaching young people about healthy relationships and red flags. She was being the person that nobody had been for her. An adult who was genuinely there to help without expecting anything in return. One day, a young girl came to her office. The girl was 17 years old and she'd been living on the streets for 6 months. She was pregnant. And she was telling Claire about a man who'd started helping her. He seems really nice, the girl had said. He's given me a job and an apartment. He's buying me everything I need. It's the first time in months that I've felt safe. Claire had listened carefully. And then she'd asked some questions. Important questions about boundaries and expectations and what exactly this man wanted from the relationship. And as the girl had answered the questions, Claire had watched her face change. She'd watched the girl start to understand that the man who seemed like salvation might actually be a predator. "I think you need to leave," Claire had said gently. "I think this situation is dangerous. And I'm going to help you." Claire had helped the girl access a women's shelter. She'd helped her report the man to the police. She'd helped her access resources and support. And she'd been the person that someone had been for her. A person who believed her, who didn't judge her, who genuinely wanted to help. Years later, when Claire was in her 30s, she was invited to speak at a conference about exploitation and trafficking of homeless youth. She'd written a book about her experience. The book was called Trust the Wrong Person: How I Survived Predatory Exploitation and Found My Way Out. At the conference, she'd shared her story. She'd told the audience about meeting Marcus. She'd told them about the gradual escalation of control and coercion. She'd told them about how she'd thought she was being helped when she was actually being exploited. But then she'd said something that had made the entire room go silent. "I want to be very clear about something," she'd said. "Marcus was predatory. Marcus was manipulative. Marcus was exploitative. But I also want to acknowledge that I was in a vulnerable position. I was homeless. I was struggling with addiction. I was desperate for help. And Marcus took advantage of that." She'd paused. "And that's not my fault," she'd continued. "That's not a reflection on me. That's a reflection on him and on a society that allows people like Marcus to prey on people like me. That's a reflection on a society that doesn't have enough resources for homeless youth. That's a reflection on a society that makes it possible for predators to access vulnerable people." She'd looked directly at the camera, knowing that this speech would be recorded. "So I want to say to anyone who's listening," she'd said, "if you're in a situation where someone is being kind to you but it's starting to feel uncomfortable or off, trust that feeling. Trust your instincts. And if you can, reach out to someone you trust. Because predators rely on isolation and shame. They rely on victims being too scared or too ashamed to ask for help." After the conference, Claire had received thousands of messages from people who'd heard her story. Many of them were from people who were currently in exploitative situations. Many of them were people who'd been through similar experiences. Many of them were telling her that her story had saved their lives. One message came from a young woman named Sarah. Sarah said, "I was in a situation exactly like yours. A man helped me when I was homeless. He seemed kind. And then he started expecting things from me that made me uncomfortable. When I heard your story, I realized that what was happening to me was not okay. I realized that I needed to leave. I left that day. I contacted the police. I'm now in a safe place. Thank you for telling your story. Thank you for making me realize that I wasn't crazy for feeling like something was wrong." Claire had cried when she read that message. She'd realized that by surviving and by speaking about her survival, she was helping other people survive too. 10 years after leaving Marcus, Claire had started her own organization. The organization was called Safe Harbor, and its mission was to provide resources and support to homeless youth, especially to help them recognize and escape exploitative situations. The organization provided emergency housing. It provided counseling and therapy. It provided job training and education support. But most importantly, it provided something that most homeless youth didn't have. It provided real adults who genuinely cared about their well-being and didn't want anything in return. Claire had hired a team of people who'd also experienced homelessness and exploitation. She'd hired people who understood the reality of what these young people were going through. She'd hired people who could say, "I've been there too. I know what you're experiencing. And I'm here to help you get out." The organization had helped hundreds of young people. Many of them had gone on to finish school. Many of them had found stable housing. Many of them had become advocates themselves, helping other people in similar situations. 15 years after leaving Marcus, Claire was sitting in her office at Safe Harbor when a familiar face walked in. It was Marcus. He'd been released from prison after serving his full 5-year sentence. And he'd come to her office. Claire's first instinct was fear. But she'd done enough therapy to know that this fear was a response based on her past trauma, not on present danger. She'd worked through enough of her trauma to know that she was not that 18-year-old girl anymore. She was a 33-year-old woman with power and resources and a support network. "What are you doing here?" she'd asked him calmly. "I wanted to apologize," Marcus had said. He'd looked different, older, harder, worn down by prison. "I've spent 5 years thinking about what I did to you. And I wanted to say that I'm sorry." Claire had listened without responding immediately. She'd let him speak. He'd told her that he'd been in therapy in prison. He'd told her that he'd come to understand the extent of the harm he'd caused. He'd told her that he'd wanted to reach out to her many times, but he'd respected her need for distance. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he'd said. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And I wanted to tell you that your story at that conference. I heard about it. I heard that you've been helping young people avoid situations like the one you were in. And I think that's important work. I think that's powerful work." Claire had felt a lot of emotions in that moment. She'd felt anger that this man had shown up in her office. She'd felt sadness that she'd been exploited by him. She'd felt fear of what her response should be. But mostly she'd felt pity. Because Marcus was a man who'd been given opportunities and who'd used those opportunities to hurt people. And his life had become small and diminished because of that. And no amount of apology could undo what he'd done. "I appreciate that you came here," Claire had said finally. "But I think it's best if you leave now. I'm not interested in your apology. I'm not interested in your explanation. What I'm interested in is making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other people. And every moment you spend here is a moment I could be spending on that work." Marcus had left her office without another word. But that encounter had affected Claire more than she'd wanted to admit. It had brought up a lot of old feelings. It had reminded her of the trauma she'd experienced. And it had made her think about forgiveness and healing in a new way. She'd decided to write an essay about the encounter. She'd published it online. And the essay had gone viral. Thousands of people had read her words about the importance of survivor empowerment and the limitations of predator rehabilitation. The essay had been shared by advocacy organizations. It had been cited in academic papers about trauma and healing. It had become part of the national conversation about how to respond to sexual assault and exploitation. And most importantly, it had helped other survivors understand that they didn't have to forgive their abusers. They didn't have to accept apologies. They didn't have to do anything that would compromise their own healing. At 40 years old, Claire was one of the most respected voices in the field of youth homelessness and exploitation prevention. She'd won awards. She'd been featured in documentaries. She'd been invited to testify before Congress about her experience and the need for better resources for homeless youth. But what she was most proud of was not any of the recognition she'd received. What she was most proud of was the hundreds of young people who'd been able to escape exploitative situations because of the work she'd done. What she was most proud of was the organization she'd built. What she was most proud of was the life she'd created for herself. Her daughter was now 22 years old and she was in college studying social work. She'd grown up watching her mother survive and rebuild. She'd grown up watching her mother help other people. And now she wanted to do the same work. "You saved me," Claire had told her mother years ago. "You came and you got me and you saved my life." "No," her mother had said. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it." Claire had understood what her mother meant. Understanding the distinction between being rescued and being given the space to rescue yourself, that was crucial. Because if Claire believed that her mother had saved her, then she would believe that she needed someone else to save her again if something went wrong. But if Claire understood that she'd saved herself, then she understood that she had the capacity within her to survive. That she had agency. That she had power. When Claire's daughter had announced that she wanted to go to college to study social work, Claire had cried. Not because she was sad, but because she was witnessing the next generation choosing to do the work of healing and helping. "I want to do what you do," her daughter had said. "I want to help people. I want to be the person for someone that you've been for so many people." "It's hard work," Claire had warned her. "You're going to hear stories that break your heart. You're going to meet people who are suffering in ways that you can't fix. You're going to feel inadequate sometimes. I know, her daughter had said. But I also saw what you did. I saw how you took your pain and you transformed it into purpose. I saw how you helped people. And I want to do that too. Claire had hugged her daughter and she'd thought about how trauma could be passed down through generations. But so could resilience. So could the determination to help others. So could the understanding that healing is possible. At 40 years old, Claire was one of the most respected voices in the field of youth homelessness and exploitation prevention. She'd won awards for her work. She'd been featured in documentaries about trafficking and exploitation. She'd been invited to testify before Congress about her experience and the need for better resources for homeless youth. But the recognition had come slowly and not without cost. There had been years when Safe Harbor had struggled financially. There had been years when Claire had worked without payment so that she could keep the organization running. There had been years when she'd second-guessed whether her work was actually making a difference. One night, about 8 years into running Safe Harbor, Claire had found herself sitting in her office at 2 a.m, crying. She'd been reading through files of young people the organization had helped. She'd been looking at their stories and trying to see if the work she was doing was actually changing anything. What if I'm not making a difference? She'd asked her mother during a phone call that night. What if I'm just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem? Her mother had listened to her daughter's doubts without trying to immediately reassure her. You're making a difference for every single person you help, her mother had said finally. That's not a Band-Aid. That's a life. That's someone's entire future changed because you intervened. That's someone who is going to be exploited or trafficked or murdered, and instead they're going to graduate from high school. That's not nothing, Claire. That's everything. That conversation had been a turning point for Claire. She'd realized that she'd been trying to solve a systemic problem on a personal level. She'd been trying to fix everything. But what she could actually do was help individuals. She could help one person at a time. And that was enough. The organization had grown. By the time Claire was 40, Safe Harbor had expanded to 3 cities. They had a staff of 40 people. They were serving over 500 young people per year. They had housing, counseling, education programs, job training, and most importantly, genuine relationships between staff and clients. But more than just the organization itself, Claire had created something else. She'd created a movement. She'd trained hundreds of social workers and case managers about how to recognize and respond to exploitation. She'd created a curriculum that was being used in schools across the country to teach young people about healthy relationships and red flags for exploitation. And she'd done something that very few people do. She'd started a public conversation about the fact that exploitation doesn't just happen in dark alleyways. It happens in homes. It happens in relationships that look normal from the outside. It happens when someone takes advantage of vulnerability. One day, a journalist came to interview Claire for a major magazine. The journalist wanted to write about how Claire had survived exploitation and gone on to help others in similar situations. During the interview, the journalist asked Claire a question that made her stop and think carefully. If you could go back and talk to your 18-year-old self, the journalist asked, what would you tell her? Claire had been silent for a long time. She'd thought about that 18-year-old girl who'd been so desperate, so vulnerable, so willing to believe that someone could save her. I would tell her that she's going to go through something terrible, Claire had said finally. I would tell her that there's going to be a man who seems kind and who will hurt her. I would tell her that the pain of what he does to her will echo through years of her life. I would tell her that she's going to struggle with trusting people. She's going to struggle with relationships. She's going to struggle with believing that anyone could want to help her without wanting something in return. She'd paused. But I would also tell her that she's going to survive, Claire had continued. I would tell her that one day her mother is going to call her and ask for forgiveness. I would tell her that she's going to have a daughter who is brilliant and kind and strong. I would tell her that she's going to build an organization that helps hundreds of people. I would tell her that the pain she goes through is going to give her the ability to help other people through their pain. I would tell her that her story is going to matter. The journalist had cried as she listened to Claire speak. Do you forgive yourself? The journalist had asked. For trusting Marcus? For not seeing the signs? Yes, Claire had said. I forgive myself because I understand now that I wasn't stupid. I wasn't naive. I was a desperate kid who needed help. And there's no shame in that. The shame belongs to Marcus. The shame belongs to a society that allows predators to access vulnerable people. The shame does not belong to me. The article had been published in the magazine and it had sparked a national conversation. Universities had started inviting Claire to speak to students about recognizing exploitation. Schools had started implementing her curriculum about healthy relationships. Companies had started hiring formerly homeless young people because they understood the value of what these young people brought to the table. But most importantly, young people who were currently in exploitative situations had started reaching out to Safe Harbor. They'd started recognizing the warning signs in their own relationships. They'd started understanding that what they were experiencing was not normal. They'd started leaving. One young woman named Tasha had reached out to Safe Harbor after reading the article about Claire. I'm in a situation like Claire's, Tasha had written. There's a man who's helping me. He got me out of homelessness. He gave me an apartment and a job. But now he's starting to ask me for things that make me uncomfortable. He's starting to control who I can talk to. He's starting to make me feel like I owe him. I'm terrified. But after reading about Claire, I realize that what he's doing is not okay. And I want to leave. Claire had personally responded to Tasha's email. She'd told her that she wasn't crazy for feeling uncomfortable. She'd told her that her instincts were right. She'd told her that she deserved help that didn't come with strings attached. Safe Harbor had worked with Tasha to get her out of the situation. They'd provided her with emergency housing. They'd helped her report the man to the police. They'd provided her with counseling. And they'd been the safe adults who believed her and helped her without expecting anything in return. Tasha had gone on to finish high school. She'd gone to community college. She'd become a case manager at Safe Harbor herself, working with other young people in exploitative situations. Years later, when Claire was doing a training for new staff members at Safe Harbor, she'd shared the story of Tasha. She'd talked about how the ripple effects of helping one person extended far beyond that one person. Tasha came to us, Claire had told the staff, because she recognized the warning signs in her own situation. She recognized them because she read about my experience. But because we helped Tasha, she's now helping dozens of other young people every year. That's how change happens. One person helps another person, and that person helps another person, and eventually you've created a movement. At 45 years old, Claire had been offered a position as the director of a national nonprofit focused on combating human trafficking and exploitation. The position would be based in Washington, D.C. It would come with a significant increase in salary and resources. It would give her the ability to work on policy at the federal level. Claire had been tempted. She'd thought about all the young people she could help if she had more resources and more power. But then she'd thought about Safe Harbor. She'd thought about the young people who came to her office every day knowing that Claire understood their experience. She'd thought about the staff she'd trained and mentored. She'd thought about the life she'd built. She'd declined the position. She'd decided to stay at Safe Harbor. She'd decided that her power wasn't in her position or her salary or her access to federal policymakers. Her power was in her presence. Her power was in showing up for young people who'd been exploited. Her power was in being the proof that survival was possible. But that didn't mean Claire stopped working on policy. She'd started consulting for nonprofits and government agencies on best practices for serving homeless and exploited youth. She'd started training social workers and case managers and law enforcement officers. She'd started writing papers and articles about her work. And slowly, quietly, the policies began to change. States started allocating more resources to programs serving homeless youth. Universities started creating programs to recruit and support formerly homeless students. Companies started understanding that formerly homeless young people brought valuable perspectives and resilience to their teams. It wasn't fast. It wasn't complete. The systems were still broken in many ways. But there was movement. There was change. And Claire understood that she was part of that change. When Claire was invited to speak at her high school, The school she'd attended before becoming homeless, she'd almost declined. Going back to that place felt like going back to a time when everything was falling apart. But she'd decided to go. She'd stood in front of 500 high school students and she'd told them her story. She'd told them about being abandoned by her mother. She'd told them about living on the streets. She'd told them about becoming pregnant at 18. She'd told them about meeting Marcus. She'd told them about what he'd done to her. But then she'd told them something that had made every single student in that auditorium pay attention. "I'm telling you this story," she'd said, "not to depress you or to scare you. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand something crucial. I want you to understand that predators are real. They exist. And they look like regular people. They look like people who are being kind. They look like people who want to help. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where something feels wrong, I want you to trust that feeling. I want you to talk to an adult. I want you to call the police. I want you to reach out to organizations like Safe Harbor." She'd looked directly at the students. "And I want you to understand that if you're in a vulnerable situation, if you're homeless, if you're struggling with addiction, if you're being abused, if you're alone, there are people who want to help you without expecting anything in return," she'd continued. "Real help exists. And you deserve that help. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to have a future." At the end of her speech, students had lined up to talk to her. They'd told her about their own experiences. They'd told her about friends who might be in exploitative situations. They'd told her that her story had changed how they thought about safety and vulnerability. One girl had approached her with tears in her eyes. "My older sister is in a situation like yours was," the girl had said. "She's living with a guy who seems to be helping her, but something about it feels wrong. After hearing your story, I think I finally understand what's going on. I think I need to help her get out." Claire had given the girl information about Safe Harbor. She'd told her that she could call any time if she needed support. She'd told her that her instinct to help her sister was exactly right. 50 years old, Claire was sitting in her office at Safe Harbor when she received a letter. The letter was from the prison where Marcus was being held. It was from Marcus himself. The letter said, "Claire, I've been in prison for 32 years. I've spent most of that time in therapy trying to understand why I hurt you the way I did. I've read your articles. I've heard about the work you're doing. I want you to know that your work has changed me. Reading about how you've taken your pain and transformed it into purpose, that's shown me what I could have done if I'd made different choices. I'm writing to tell you that I'm sorry. And I'm writing to tell you that I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to be proud of you. But I am. You took something terrible and you made something beautiful out of it." Claire had read the letter multiple times. She'd shown it to her mother. She'd processed it in therapy. "I don't forgive him," she'd told her therapist. "But I also don't hate him anymore. What I feel is mostly indifference. He's someone who hurt me a long time ago. And I've spent the rest of my life making sure that what he did to me doesn't happen to other people. And that's enough." When Claire retired from her position as executive director of Safe Harbor at 55, she'd done so knowing that the organization would continue without her. She'd trained a successor. She'd established an endowment that would ensure the organization's financial stability for decades. She'd created systems and processes that would allow the work to continue even after she was gone. But what she'd left as her greatest legacy wasn't in any of those systems. What she'd left as her greatest legacy was the understanding that survival is possible. That healing is possible. That transformation is possible. Her successor was a woman named Deandra who'd been through Safe Harbor's program as a young person. Deandra had been homeless at 16. Deandra had been exploited by a man who seemed to be helping her. Deandra had found Safe Harbor. Deandra had gotten help. Deandra had finished school. Deandra had gone to college. Deandra had become a social worker. And now Deandra was running the organization that had saved her life. At Deandra's first press conference as the new executive director, she talked about Claire's legacy. "Claire showed me that my past didn't have to be my future," Deandra had said. "She showed me that the worst thing that had happened to me could become the thing that allowed me to help other people. She showed me that healing is possible. And now I'm going to do the same thing for other young people. I'm going to show them that they can survive, that they can heal, that they can build beautiful lives. 20 years after retiring, Claire was 85 years old. She was living in a small house near the ocean with her wife, whom she'd married at 50. She'd found love after years of being afraid of intimacy. She'd built a life that looked nothing like what she would have predicted when she was 18 and homeless and pregnant. Her daughter had become a nationally recognized expert in trauma-informed care. Her daughter had published books about her mother's story and how it had inspired her work. Her daughter had trained thousands of social workers. Claire's granddaughter, her daughter's daughter, was in high school. And she was already talking about wanting to work in social services because she'd grown up hearing her mother and grandmother talk about the importance of helping vulnerable people. The trauma was being transformed across generations. The pain was being converted into purpose. The story of exploitation and survival was becoming a story of healing and hope. So here's what I want to ask you in the comments section. Have you ever trusted someone who betrayed you? Have you ever had someone exploit your vulnerability? Have you recognized red flags in a relationship? And most importantly, have you learned to trust your instincts when something feels wrong? I want to ask you, what are the warning signs of exploitation? What should you do if you notice those signs in your own life or in someone else's life? What responsibility do we have as a society to protect vulnerable people? I want to ask you, do you know someone who might be in a situation like Claire's situation? Have you thought about what you would do if someone you loved was being exploited? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell me if it resonated with you. Tell me if you saw yourself in Claire's story. Tell me if this story has changed how you think about vulnerability and predation and the importance of real help. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Because there are so many stories like this one. There are so many stories about people who've survived exploitation and trauma. There are so many stories about people who've rebuilt their lives. There are so many stories about the power of genuine help and real connection. There are so many stories about how one person's survival can become the inspiration for thousands of other people's survival. If you or someone you know is being exploited or abused, please reach out for help. Call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. Text HELP to 233733 or visit www.humantraffickinghotline.org. There are real people ready to help. You deserve safety. You deserve support. You deserve a future. I'll see you next time.